Welcome everybody on this wet and rainy Sunday. Well done for making it here. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Gafoor Lecture in Indentureship and Its Legacies. This is an event that's being held by the Isu Prasad Centre for Caribbean Studies in conjunction with Guyana Speaks. What I wanted to do first of all is just to run through housekeeping. I notice there's a few of you that haven't been here before. So it's just to let you know that if you're looking for the loos, it's that door there, the first door there on my left-hand side. In the unlikely event, obviously of a fire, please just exit via the door you came in. And also please remember to turn your mobile phones to off. We've got today the bookstall, so that's the Hansard bookstalls. They'll be selling Amina Gafoor's book as well as books by Clem, Professor Clem Sisharan. And then we've also invited today Selina, who is a British artist of Guyanese heritage. And I don't know if many of you know that Guyana Speaks likes to kind of promote the work of other Guyanese people in the community. So generally we always have somebody here who's sort of highlighting the products they have, or their artwork or their books or something like that. So I'd love it if at the end of this program you went and all had a look at Selina's work and purchased it. Selina, stand up so everybody knows who you are. Yes, Selina. And then I just wanted to make you aware of the program. So basically, we'll be having, Clem will be speaking to you around about 2:40 or perhaps before then. I'm going to then be doing a Q&A, and then we'll have a refreshment break at 3:30. We don't normally have a break actually when we do Guyana Speaks, but because we're kind of running on a bit longer than usual, we'll have a little break at 3:30. It says up on the screen Morby, but actually we ran out of Morby, so it's Ginger. And then that will be followed by a film on the life of Isu Prasad at about 3:45. And then at 4:30, Bob Ramdani is going to be invited to chair a short session about Amina Gafoor's, apologies for spelling her name incorrectly there, should be 00, on her new book, The Evolution of Writing in English by and about East Indians of Guyana. And then it'll end just with us letting you know about future Guyana Speaks events, and then we'll go on to having some food and drink. So just to remind you that you'll need a chit to collect food, which is today we've got chicken roti, pumpkin roti, and some chana. So if I could invite David Navely to introduce Clem.
Yeah, right, thank you. Thank you. There's,
I'll take the notes,
yeah. I will sit because I have a bad back. Well, let me thank you all for coming to this Gafoor lecture, the Gafoor 2019 lecture. But before I introduce Professor Clem Sisharan, let me thank you, Anita Cox and Rod Westerners, very much for putting an enormous amount of effort working with me representing the University of Warwick. But I was doing very little work. For putting this together, and I'm really grateful to you. And this is our first cooperation between the University of Warwick and Guyana Speaks, and I hope we will continue it. We have 15 years worth of lectures. The Gafoor lecture series will be a 15-year program. The first one was in 2017, given by Professor Brinsley Samaru. The second was given by Professor Tina Ramnarayan in 2018. And now we have the third Gafoor lecture being given by Professor Clem Sisharan. Now, let me introduce Clem by saying that he was, Clem is the former Professor of Caribbean History and Head of Caribbean Studies at London Metropolitan University. This was between 1993 and 2012. During his time, over 500 students graduated in Caribbean Studies, which is really remarkable. His book, he's written a dozen books. I mean, they're so heavy that I can't have them on the first floor of my house. I have them in the ground floor, because they'll break the floorboards. He's a copious, brilliant, and amazingly fertile writer. And I think some of his books are for sale by RFLE. I'm not going to talk about his 14 books, his 12 books, 13 books. I just want to say to you that, first of all, he was awarded a doctorate at the University of the West Indies in 2017 in recognition of his scholarship and his educational work in Britain. And it is very rare, believe me, that the University of the West Indies awards doctorates to people in the diaspora. So it was a really great honor for him, right, to have received that. Now, Clem wrote a book that won the Elsevier Prize in 2005. The Elsevier Prize is the Caribbean Historians Nobel Prize. It is the biggest, most prestigious prize for a book on Caribbean history. You don't have to be a Caribbean scholar. It's a book on Caribbean history. It is the most prestigious prize. It's the Booker Prize of Caribbean history, historiography. And Clem won that in 2005 with his book Bittersweet, Bitter Sugar, Jock Campbell, the Booker Reformer in British Guyana, 1934 to 1966. And what I want to do really to introduce Clem and then shut up is just to read the citation from the Elsevier Prize Committee in 2005, the citation. So these are not my words, these are the words of the judges. And I'll just read this paragraph on why Clem was awarded the Elsevier Prize. By any measure, Clem Ciceran has produced an extraordinarily impressive book in Caribbean history and historiography. In an area where the genre of the biography is relatively neglected, and whenever attempted, too often confines itself narrowly to political biography, Clem Ciceran has efficaciously demonstrated that eliminating conventional boundaries can result in genuinely majestic work. My God, that's the first time I've ever heard an academic book described as genuinely majestic. I mean, we ought to bow, really, you know?
Whatever you want to do. Buy me a drink or something.
Hold on a minute. And then I'll dot for you. In 675, this is still the citation, in 675 thrilling pages. I mean, have you ever heard an academic book being thrilling? Well, I must say it is thrilling because I spent 17 hours in one go reading it. Because once you pick it up, it's compelling. Yeah? In 675 thrilling pages, this magisterial account maneuvers the reader through one of the most painfully fragmentary periods of Guyanese history. This elegantly written, carefully edited, and attractively presented book does great credit to the author and publisher. Anyway, that was what they said, right? I will end up by saying what Clem's father said to me. Yeah? I went to see Clem's father, and many, many people have written brilliantly in Clem. That citation is just one of many, believe me, right? I went to see Clem's father many years ago in Palmyra, and I was talking about Clem. There were some cows in the bottom house, you know, and I was talking about Clem, and I was saying to him, you know, how did this happen? Because I took a book back, one of Clem's books, to give to the temple. So this is what the father said, right? He said, I buy a read book bad. Since he little, me say, son, put down a book and go eat. You go blind how much you read. But he hard ears. He read till he eye water. And he still a read till kerosene lamp go out, and he still a read. So I then said to the father, because I made notes, where did he get his love of books? From you? He said, me na read one ras. me na no book. Me no cow. Only when pandits read in Mandir, me know a wise book. And then I took your book. So that is Clem Ciceran. Clem, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, David. We go back a very long way. And I'd just like to make some brief introductory remarks before I do this talk. And that is to recall that it was David who got me out of Guyana because I got stuck there again and was behaving badly. And by chance, he got me out of Guyana. He was one of the founders of the Center for Caribbean Studies at the University of Warwick around 1984. And I started my PhD there, and I'm proud to say that I was the first PhD graduate from the Center of Caribbean Studies. And it would not have happened without David, because I was behaving so badly that I probably would have been dead by now. Somebody would have shot me. I shan't elaborate on that. I want to thank David for asking me to do the third Gafu lecture. I want to thank and compliment Juanita and Rod for all the work they have done to continue month after month to sponsor these Guyana Speaks. It's not easy to do. There is a lot of work, and let us give them a big applause again. I'd like to thank Arif Ali and Hansib. Please buy out all the books he's got there. That year after year, through all kinds of struggle in this digital age, he continues to produce these excellent books, including some of them that are too big, some of which are written by me. And I also want to thank Amina and Sattar Ghafoor for sponsoring this Ghafoor lecture, annual Ghafoor lecture on Indian indentureship. It's a tremendous gesture, and it's a great thing to do in the interest of scholarship. And finally, I want to thank all of you for coming out to listen to me today. Now, what I have to say departs from some of the conventional thinking on Indian indentureship. And I make some points that have become quite controversial, because I've departed from the old narrative, and that is that all these people were so stupid that they were kidnapped and pushed into this boat to become Indian indentured laborers in places like Trinidad and Guyana and Suriname, Mauritius and Fiji. Now, we grew up knowing absolutely nothing at all about this India from where these people came. This was not discussed. And although I grew up, I was old enough to know many indentured laborers, retired people in their 70s or 80s. That was a closed book. It was never discussed. So we knew nothing at all about the background of these people, what prompted them to leave such a far place to go to places that they knew nothing at all about. Other thing is, what were the things that prompted them? Were they all tricked? Were they all kidnapped? Were they so stupid that for over 70 or 75 years this thing went on? Some went back and some came back. So this thing involved over 1 million people. But it was an area of darkness. We knew little about it. And I must have been about 30 years old or more before I started to inquire into what prompted these people to go to remote places like British Guyana and Trinidad and Suriname and Fiji and Mauritius, even to parts of South Africa and Natal and so on. And I found it difficult to believe that all these people were tricked over this period of time. And it wasn't until about 1985 or 1986 that I came upon some remarkable work by a very distinguished historian, an Indo-Fijian historian named Brijlal, an outstanding scholar and a beautiful writer of the English language. And unlike people like myself and David, he speaks both the Bhojpuri dialect of Hindi as well as standard Hindi, and puts people like me to shame. But the most extraordinary thing he did, and of course his knowledge of Hindi and Bhojpuri helped him to do this, was that when he decided to do his doctoral thesis, which I believe was done at the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia, he decided to visit these villages and these places, these districts in eastern Uttar Pradesh and western Bihar in northern India, where these people came from. Juanita will show you roughly where these places are. Eastern UP and western Bihar. And over 85% of the indentured laborers who went to places like British Guyana and Trinidad came from that area. We didn't know any of this thing. We've heard of Madras people and so on, who also went to British Guyana, but they were a very small minority of people who came from the extreme south, southeast. You see that area there, kind of light blue in Madras, near to Sri Lanka. But they were only about 5 or 6%. So overwhelmingly, we could say that roughly about 85% of these people who went as indentured laborers came roughly from the same culture area. And that is what is called the Bhojpur or Bhojpuri culture, which a distinct dialect of Hindi with particular cultural characteristics and so on. But I think what was most revealing about Professor Brijlal's work was the fact that over 2/3 of the women who were taken as indentured laborers to Fiji as well as the Caribbean, over 2/3 of these women went on their own. This was quite extraordinary. How could you explain that 2/3 of these women were not accompanied by anybody at all? Now, that was quite astounding. And to understand that, you have to go back to the social history of eastern Uttar Pradesh and western Bihar in the latter half of the 19th century. Now, I've traveled in this area a few times. And I can tell you, remains the most depressed part of India, the poorest part of India. And when I meet people from Gujarat or Rajasthan, sometimes I just say vaguely where I come from. I don't tell them I come from that area at all. Because if you tell a Gujarati or a Punjabi that you come from that area, he wouldn't talk to you again. He said, let's move on. That is how depressed and the kind of negative perception it has. And I think that begins to help you to understand why so many of these women went on their own. Because it wasn't only a question of indentureship. It was a question of women in the latter part of the 19th century, in the context of British colonialism, moving away from many of these areas because they had absolutely no hope at all. It was staying there and either dying, because there are numerous famines in that area in the latter part of the 19th century. But the worst part of it is that you were socially dead, because the overwhelming majority of girls between 10 and 14 were already married. So you can imagine the amount of child widows, these girls who were child widows, because famine was so widespread in the latter part of the 19th century in these places, that many of them would have been child widows. And child widows had no social role anymore in these societies. Because if you were 12 years old or 13 years old and your husband had died in the famine, or the other thing was you had chronic diseases, you know, smallpox, cholera, these things were endemic. When you read some of the descriptions, they're almost kind of descriptions of medieval catastrophes. So it wasn't only that they were now widowed at the age of 14, but you couldn't remarry because the tradition said that that was the end of your social existence. But worse than that, it was almost as if, you know, people believed in the idea of karma, that what you are now facing is a consequence of what you did in the previous life. So if you were 13 years old and already widowed, you must have done something totally abominable to have ended up where you've ended up. The trouble was, you couldn't go back to your own family's home because that was seen as a disgrace, a curse on your home. And you were now relegated to the lowest level in this home of your in-laws where the husband is already dead. So you can imagine what it meant for people like that, young people like that there was no hope. Anything was a form of liberation. Getting out of there and trying to exist somehow was a form of liberation. And what was interesting about it, and this is where Professor Bidlal's work was so informative, that he found out that most of the women, young women, because a high percentage of them were between 14 and 20, very few over the age of 25 or 30, who went as indentured laborers to British Guyana. So they were young people who were, you know, even if not physically fit, they had their whole lives ahead of them. And therefore, going somewhere where you can get any form of employment was better than being in that situation where you were economically dead, where you were social reject, and where you had absolutely no future at all. It was such an appalling situation to be in that only very extraordinary young women could have even summoned up the hope to want to do anything, to start all over again. And these were extraordinary people. These were absolutely extraordinary people. Because many of them also were from lower castes, including, in the case, and I talked briefly towards the end about my great-grandmother, who was an untouchable woman, a black woman, very dark. And blackness and darkness in the Indian tradition is highly despised. Okay? So you could imagine a woman who was untouchable, black, and poor, of course, because she came from a caste called Parsi, which was just like Chamar, which meant that you really had no function within that society. You were not quite human. And this is not just a historical conception of this thing, you know. If you go to India today, up to 2 days ago, I read in the paper, I usually read a paper called The Hindu. The best English language paper. It has nothing to do with Hinduism. It was founded by the British in 1878 in Madras. I read 2 days ago where this landlord of a higher caste just went and shot these two boys and killed them because they were defecating in the fields. But they had no toilet. So what are you going to do? And they applied to get a government toilet, and Modi said, you're going to give all of them. Modi is another criminal, but I won't go into that. So anyway, so they didn't get a toilet, so they still had to go and defecate in the field. And the man just come and he shot them in the head, 2 of them. Now, this is not extraordinary behavior. until today, if you are Chamar or you are Parsi from the caste which my great-grandmother came from, you're not really a human being. This is a brutal society I'm talking about, you know. And this is very uncomfortable. Indians don't like to talk about this. And that is why I get into trouble all the time. But I do not care. That is the role of the scholar and the intellectual. You must be prepared to challenge these things. So that was the background from which somebody like my great-grandmother of this Parsi caste, but I didn't even know she was a Parsi caste. I didn't even know who a Parsi was. It was not until I was way in my 30s that I discovered who these people were. And they were what you call toddy makers. You know, they make booze out of coconut. But the other occupation was they used to hunt wild birds and wild animals. So Parsi means a noose that you used to make to hunt and catch wild animals. So I like to think that given what my great-grandmother, my maternal great-grandmother achieved in British Guyana, that she escaped that noose. That is why I say it's an escape to freedom. Because that society offered you no possibilities of getting beyond that environment. Okay? No possibilities at all. But other thing that Professor Bidlal pointed out was that it was not a total dead end. There were some options for those who were prepared to take the chance. And if you were in such a desperate situation, I could imagine any chance would have been attractive. And that is, because of British colonialism, you had the opening up of the Assam tea plantations in the northeast, which is a long way from eastern Uttar Pradesh, but it offered possibility of escape from that familiar social environment which had already written you off. So that was one thing. You were removing yourself from that social environment, but you were also going into a situation where you, as a single woman, could earn a living and at least begin to try to recoup something of your own dignity. So it was a kind of a trial run in a way, that people could have, a few thousand of them could go off to find employment in the extreme northeast in Assam. Some of them went to work in the terrible conditions of the Bihar coal mines in neighboring to Uttar Pradesh. Some of them got employment in the many factories that developed in the context of British colonialism in Calcutta. In fact, Calcutta was the port from which many of these or most of these indentured laborers left. So it is not surprising that many of these women would have been recruited in Calcutta because they had left their native villages, they'd broken all kinds of those social links and so on. And in a sense, that liberated them because they were not stuck any longer to that extremely difficult social network that stultified you. It gave you a degree of ambition. And that was the context in which many of these women were recruited. Now I should point out that many of these ships did not reach the quota. The quota was from about 1870. The quota on each ship was that you should try and get at least, that the recruiter should try and get at least 40% of the ship should be women. Because they were important not only as partners for men on the plantations, but they were important as workers in their own right. They were recruited as workers in their own right. Many of these people had come from agricultural backgrounds, and even people from the lowest caste, they also had experience of working in the fields, in planting rice, in growing a range of vegetables and so on. I should also point out that the best agriculturalists, people like the Kurmis and the Koris and their Hears, these are different castes. I know that Dr. Jagan said he came from the Kurmi caste. Now, all these people were excellent agriculturalists. I don't have the time to talk about this. But the interesting thing is they owned very little land. Although they were the best agriculturalists, the land was owned by the upper caste of Brahmins and Kayas and Kshatriyas and so on. Now, about 15% of the people who went to the Caribbean would have been Muslims. But the Muslims also, most of them were pretty depressed, living in extremely difficult conditions. Now, one of the things about being in the same boat, literally, and being in the same ship, is that you became Jahaji Bhais or Jahaji Bahins, irrespective of your caste background. So what was happening there, when I say an escape to freedom, was that those barriers that had divided people had started to break down, first internally with people migrating to other areas to work, and secondly, by getting on board these ships where they didn't allot you on the basis of caste, they allotted you on the basis of sex. Men were kept separate from women. But irrespective, whether you were Brahmin, and there were Brahmin women who went as well because they were poor Brahmins, they were poor Kshatriyas, although they were in a minority. But for the first time, these people would have met together in a social network. Because in India, if you were an untouchable or lower caste, the higher caste would never, not only not go to your house, but they would not take cooked food from you. Now this was the difference, that on the plantations, the British capitalists, the plantation owners, plantocracy, did not recognize the social stratification system that obtained in India. They had no recognition of caste. They saw you as a work unit. Are you productive? Are you likely to be a productive worker? How do I mobilize you to make sure I get the maximum from you? Now, this was the thing. So for a lot of women, some of them for the first time, but many of them also had experience of working on their own, escaping their narrow village environment. This was an opportunity for many of them, not only to earn their own wages, but to also to choose who they want to live with. And some of them chose as they felt necessary, that leaving 2 or 3 men if this chap is a drunkard and lazy and he don't want to work and beating me up, I'm going to leave his ass. And there were many cases, and that is why you also had a high incidence of wife murders or partner murders on the plantations. I have to rush through this thing, but we have a question and answer period. Now, the good thing about the plantations in British Guyana and that plantation environment on the coast of Guyana was that although the African people had settled in many villages which they had bought and had acquired, there were still vast areas of virgin, uncultivated land along the coast of Guyana. So the option for many of these indentured laborers, and of course the women as well, because they were the core of this thing, was to move beyond the uncertainty of the plantation and to reconstruct the Indian family as they understood it, which was the patriarchal family. So in some ways, the women were losing a degree of freedom, leaving the plantation and moving into the villages. But at the same time, they were reconstituting the Indian family as an extended family. Remember, most of these women went on their own. They were not accompanied by any relatives. And it is quite extraordinary that in these village environments in particular, not only were they able to reconstitute families, but some of these families became huge and very big. The other thing was that people could move to a great extent because women were always a minority. There was a shortage of women for a long time. Even up to the 1920s, there was only 100 woman-man ratio. So you could see a lot of men did not get married and so on, or got married very late. But what it meant was that women became very important as a part of this unit, because what the family unit was, it was an economic unit which allowed them and their children who were married, who would probably move into the same compound or the same area, if not the same home, but in the same yard, to use that labor with daughters-in-law and so on, to work both on the plantation as well as to cultivate rice and to grow and to rear cattle and so on. So the extended family, which was reconstituted and women were the center of this thing, was very important to the success of many of these families in adapting to the villages. I will finish by reading a bit here from this woman whose name was Kaila, who was my great-grandmother. And it's also interesting that my paternal great-grandmother was Muslim. Now that would have been unthinkable in village India. So it just goes to show that to a great extent, not only was caste being eroded, but in cases because of the shortage of women, that it even went beyond the old border between Hindu and Muslim. But I want to talk about this untouchable woman, Kaila, from the Parsi caste, and I'll finish here because I think I'm running out of time. This is about Kaila, this black woman from the Parsi caste. She went to British Guyana on the Ganges, that's a boat, in September 1909. She was the last of my ancestors who went to British Guyana. She came from Bhagwanpur village in Gonda district in eastern UP, near to Basti on the border with Nepal, which is to the north. She was 20 years old and traveled alone. No relatives, man or woman or child accompanied her. The ship's register says she gave her caste as Parsi. Now, I'd never heard of this. I had never heard of it, so it took me some time to discover that it was a very low caste, indeed an outcast, what we call Dalit today, of palm or toddy tappers, makers of booze, hunters of wild birds and small game, as well as pig rearers, all ritually low occupations. It soon dawned on me that her black complexion was indeed a badge of her low caste origin. Parsis are descended from an aboriginal tribe, black people. So her name, Kaila, is probably a corruption of Kala, which means black. I learned that the name Parsi derives from a word meaning noose, used in trapping small game. I have reflected often on this and reached the conclusion that by escaping her outcast ascription, this remarkable, untouchable woman had indeed escaped the noose thing around her neck that gave her no options to recover. She could well have been a widow, a child widow. Moreover, Kaila's untouchable roots made me think about the hurdles she must have encountered in acquiring the self-confidence to construct a new persona, to forge a new life of dignity in a distant land. And I could empathize regularly thereafter with this black Parsi woman who laid the foundation for my family to scale other hurdles towards success in other foreign lands. To construct her new persona it was imperative for Kyla to erase her Indian past of degradation, to learn to forget, to cultivate amnesia. Now, me can't remember nothing at all. This was replicated by most of the indentured immigrants. Hence, the rigid collective amnesia that encompassed their whole antecedents. They remember nothing. Yet, the resilience, the imagination, the consistency of effort of most of these indentures is beyond doubt. I do not know if or for how long Kyla labored in the sugarcane fields of Rose Hall Estate in Berbice, in Kanji, but for most of her life on the plantation, she worked in the creche. She didn't work in the fields, taking care of the children of the senior personnel, the managers and overseers, looking after their children. The white overseers on the estate must have recognized a solidity in her that imbued them with the confidence that she was worthy of such responsibility. This strengthens Kyla's resolve immeasurably. She had a bit of status. She was paid better than the women in the fields. She was endowed with amazing thrift, very mean. So too her husband, a man named Jagannath. Their savings enabled them to acquire the land and the cows that provided the security. David talked about the cows. The cows that provided the security for Ram Dulari, my nanny or my maternal grandmother, and her children in the village to acquire a degree of wealth and a degree of confidence and to want to pursue education. I learned that Jagannath also did not work in the sugarcane fields. He was the head gardener for the administrative manager at Rose Hall. Like Kyla, he must have been a trustworthy and skillful person. I was thus able to comprehend why they never wanted to leave Plantation Rose Hall, although they had bought bits of land in the villages. They stayed on there, and their only child, their only daughter, who was my maternal grandmother, had a degree of economic base that gave us the confidence to rise above the status of being a coolie. I want to finish now by saying that some years ago, this doctoral thesis that I did because of David's help to me was published as Tigers in the Stars, and it was one of the first books published by Warwick University Caribbean series. And this book deals with, unfortunately it's out of print, but it deals with a lot of this story. And it's called Tiger in the Stars, and this is where I'll finish, because my great friend Ian MacDonald, the Guyanese poet and writer, I've edited some of his essays in one of the books that's available here. He wrote a story some years ago called Tiger in the Stars, and that is why I call this book so. And I will just finish by reading Ian's brief story, just 2 paragraphs, called Tiger in the Stars. Because I think this story tells you about the strength of character that this untouchable woman who was a nobody at all in India had the chance to become somebody in British Guyana and to make it possible for people like myself to have the confidence and the ambition to become who we've become. But this story of Ian MacDonald's epitomizes this strength of character and this resolve. Ian MacDonald writes this about this Bong coolie coming over, crossing the Kalapani, coming to British Guyana. When he was a boy, the old man, it may have been his grandfather, used to tell him about the time he came across the Kalapani, the dark waters, from India to British Guyana. It seemed like months, if not years, the voyage lasted. And the one clear memory the old man had was that each night on the deck, he looked at the stars blazing in the sky And gradually, as night succeeded night across the oceans, his eyes, coached by the imagination, gradually picked out the shape of a tiger leaping in the sky amidst the stars. That is what he recalled in the hardship and the monotony and the homesickness of the journey. A tiger leaping in the sky amid the stars, escaping to freedom. And he told it to his grandson, and his grandson told it to me. And he traced himself for me, that tiger shape, still blazing in the sky. And now, at nights, at certain times of the year, I still look up and I think of the old Bang Coolie on his long voyage, and the generations who have done well after him. And it seems to me the tiger leaping in the stars must become for him a sort of symbol of pride and strength and beauty, which he could not then hope to possess, but which perhaps he could yearn for in his new land one day. And it seems to me also that the generations have not misplaced the symbol or the old man's yearning. And here finally, something about the Parsi again that I only picked up a few days ago. Kyla was an untouchable, what they call a Dalit. So it pleased me to read what an Indian scholar, a man named Badri Narayan, had to say about the creation of heroes among the Parsis of North India, these untouchable people, many of them still living in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. The invention of tradition. He observes, sources of vision and contemplation are absent without literature. This feeling, along with the growing urge to construct an assertive identity and the sense of being deprived of history, has led the Parsi communities from which Kyla comes towards the invention of heroes. They are writing their own stories now and printing it. Histories and myths and their documentation in the print medium. This has come too late for Kyla. But I'm proud to claim her not merely as my indefatigable Parsi ancestor from Gonda, eastern Uttar Pradesh, but also as a hero on merit in my limited pantheon of heroes. So Kyla, from a Dalit and untouchable in Gonda, she was able to become a free woman with pride in her achievement at Plantation Rose Hall. Some escape to freedom indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much. 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Clem. I felt like I was back in the university with Clem. Clem was my lecturer when I did my BA Caribbean Studies. So Tiger in the Stars was one of the first books that I read. So thank you very much, Clem. Can we just have one more round of applause for Clem?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Clem, you did extremely well. Clem was famous for overrunning, and he only went 10 minutes over, so I'm very grateful. We've got 10 minutes of Q&A. If anybody has got a question, yes, Toby, please. If you could stand up, say your name, and just project your voice as far as possible.
Hi, thank you, Clem.
Yeah, thank you.
Toby.
Thank you.
I just want to know whether you...
Could you speak up a bit, please?
Yeah,
Thank you. I just want to know whether you can say anything about the seeming paradox that I'm seeing in my own research about my family and generally Indians in the Caribbean, in terms of the erosion of the caste system and religious religious divisions within the plantation,
Yes.
and the recent reconnection that many people like myself researching the Indian indentured system, but also the divisions that seem to be created from certain sections of the Indian Caribbean population, and even Fiji and Mauritius.
Yeah,
Hope that
Tony,
makes sense.
that's a very big question. Because I can't speak
Clem,
over...
let me give you the mic.
Yes, so you said it's a very big question, because we're dealing with a very different situation, a period, in Hindi they speak of the Kali Yuga, the Dark Age. There are a lot of negative things that are developing all over the place, among Hindus as well as Muslims, not only in India, which is becoming an increasingly intolerant place, and I shan't go into that. But it's having repercussions, even in places like Guyana today. But let me just, if I may just stick to the plantation environment, that from the moment these people were collected in the depot before embarkation on the ships in Calcutta, the colonial authorities who were responsible for recruitment and the shipping of these people to the Caribbean and Fiji and Mauritius and so on, they did not adhere to whatever the caste divisions might have been within these societies. These are capitalists dealing with laborers as a body, as a bulk. Okay? And therefore, the process of the erosion of caste was beginning there almost from the inception. And of course, on board the ships, and in some cases before you had steamships, these were sailing ships, which would take 3 months to get from Calcutta to Georgetown or Port of Spain, as the case may be. And therefore, people had to interact on this little ship. So all the notions and all the taboos that went with caste, including dining with your own and not taking food from others, not taking food from Muslims, or not taking food from chamars or lower caste people. Even higher caste people who were there, and they were, always 10-12% who were of higher caste, they had to adhere by those conditions, those fixtures that were in place on the ships. And of course, when they went to the plantations, when they lived in the lodges. Now, it's interesting that these lodges, many of them went back to the days of slavery. Because when I was growing up on a place like Port Morenton, so they still call it the nigger yard. Because it went back to the days of slavery, and the planters had patched up these things. So people had to live, whatever your caste, whatever your religion, you had to live in these places and you had to interact as best as you can, and there's very little privacy. So there were many Muslim families, for instance, that I feel totally related to, apart from the fact that my paternal great-grandmother was Muslim. But many Muslim families that I felt related to, because they were jihadis of some of my ancestors. And that relationship of jihadis became even stronger. And the fact that you had a few women, 40-50% at one point, meant that even higher caste men, to get a wife, had to marry women who were known to be of lower caste. So I think it was a revolution in many ways, and it helped to break down those barriers. The contemporary situation is a different story. I don't have the time to talk about that.
Thanks to the wonderful Professor David Daberdeen, I'm an associate fellow in his Caribbean Studies department at Warwick University. Both of my paternal grandparents were of Indian Jamaican descent, and in fact my grandmother said she had hair right down to her the lower back. But she was called Miss Chinny because some Jamaicans are so daft they can't tell the difference from one set of Asians to another. So that related to her being Chinese when she was actually of Indian descent. You'll be aware that Jamaicans call all people of Arab descent Syrians. So, you know, there's that sort of generic. My point is really, given your scholarship, your undoubted scholarship, Clem, where would you say that Indian Jamaicans came from in India? We're told maybe from Bihar, which is near to Bangladesh and West Bengal, or is it a mixture? Thank you.
Yes, Mark. If I say this, I think the person who has done the most work on the Indians in Jamaica is the very distinguished Jamaican historian, a woman named Vereen Shepherd, who is still teaching at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. And Vereen has done quite a bit of work. Now, from what I recall, there were about 34,000 Indians who were taken to Jamaica, which is small, only 34,000 taken to Jamaica, compared to 238,909 who were taken to British Guyana, and about 144,000 plus who were taken to Trinidad. So it was a small amount taken to Jamaica. I shan't go into the reason why, although I could explain that. And as far as I have ascertained from Vereen's work, the origins of the Jamaican Indians is very similar to the origins of the bulk of the Indians in Trinidad and British Guyana. In fact, it was invariably the same vessels that took them around the Cape of Good Hope around southern Africa, and they would stop at Durban before they went around the Cape of Good Hope. Across the Atlantic, sometimes they stopped at Suriname, sometimes and they stopped in Georgetown, they stopped in Port of Spain, and small amounts that were left, if they were requisitioned by Jamaican plantations, were then taken on to Jamaica. So they would have been the last to be let off the ships. Now, the thing is that the Jamaican sugar industry was already in decline in the aftermath of slavery, whereas the Trinidadian and the Guyanese sugar industries were expanding more after the end of slavery. So the demand for labor was much greater in Trinidad and British Guyana than it was in Jamaica. Apart from that, most of the people, the African people who had come off the plantations after the end of slavery, considered land very important, and that is how many of these villages on the coast of Guyana were acquired by African people, because that represented their conception of freedom. So a lot of that labor was no longer available to the planters, and that opened up a huge vacuum into which the Indians came. And that is the foundation also, because some of the Africans used to work strategically in harvest period for higher wages and call the price they wanted. And this was undercut by the bringing in of Indian indentured laborers, and the state paid 1/3 of the cost, subsidizing that indentureship. So the problems we have today have very deep roots in our history. Thank you, John.
Glenn, I'm going to ask you a provocative question because you're a friend, I can do it. How long did it take the Indians to go from Dalits to Brahmins and the ruling class?
How long what?
How long did it take them to go from Dalits, untouchables, to the ruling class? What historical period?
So he's talking about upward mobility, going from the Dalits to the Brahmins, reinventing status.
Where you mean in the Caribbean?
No, Guyana.
In Guyana, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's very difficult to ascertain. Because you couldn't become a Brahmin simply by upward mobility. You had to be born a Brahmin until today. Now, whether that was always the case, I mean, I don't know. But you can't say, I couldn't, for instance, although I could prove that one of my ancestors was a Brahmin. You know, these families are very diverse because you had sort of great shortage of women, you see. But if you were not known or seen to be a Brahmin, you couldn't, as even a Kshatriya of a high caste, or even...
I'm not asking about caste, I'm asking about economics. How long did it take the poor to become...
Oh, I see.
Oh, well, that's an individual thing. I mean, I wouldn't consider my family very rich, but I think I would consider my family, you know, quite well off, because I discovered that their caste, or for most of them, not Kyla, the woman I was talking about, but for most of my family, they would have been what you call ahirs, were the traditional cattle herders in eastern UP and western Bihar. So the fact that our family, for more than 100 years, were cattle rearers and cattle herders, gave us a certain freedom. Not very rich, but you know, gave us a certain independence. But I think it varied with families. You know, it's not something you could simply chart. But the point is that you had greater freedom to try to become a small businessman in the village, or to try to become a cattle herder or something, you know.
We've only got two or three more questions, and they have to be very brief. Selena, I saw you had your hand up, Ray also, and then Enid. Yeah, so I'll be quick.
I'm in awe of my great-great-grandmothers and that journey they made. It's totally in awe. And very, I feel really privileged to have benefited from that. I'd really like to know a bit more about the status of women in wider society within Guyana, if you can.
Yes, and that's another very big question.
Clem, can I just get the other two questions,
Yes.
and then we'll try and do it all in one go.
Yes.
Ray.
Yes, I just wanted to address the problem of the caste system.
Yep.
That gentleman asked you how long it would take to be a Brahmin. And I'm intrigued because I read the caste system originated as an economic division, whereas people who had ability to be intellectuals was of a higher caste. They were Brahmins. And people, you know, who were sweeping the roads were, what do they call them?
Chamars?
Chamars, yes. So, Clem, now you are a Brahmin. You're not a Parsi anymore, because that, I understand, was the origin of the caste system. It was economic, and if you had the ability to be, if you had the brains to, even though you were dark, you could rise to be a Brahmin. No?
I think that was more of a comment. So, Brahmin, I'm just going to get one more question.
Yes, ma'am. You've identified the economic imperative in the trade of labor. In the mid-80s, I was in St. Augustine and picked up a bibliography of writings on Indian indentureship in the Caribbean. And it appears that every single country that had previously enslaved labor recruited Indian indentured labor. So it was a broad spread. Now, in terms of women in that mix, is there any sense, because there are obviously smaller and smaller communities outside of Guyana and Trinidad, is there any sense of a lasting legacy in, you know, the most far-flung territories that you've been able to pick up on?
Thank you, Ray.
Selina, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you're asking about the to what extent women were economically viable or something like that in Guyanese society now?
My question was, what was the status of those women in a wider society
Yes.
in Guyana?
Yes.
What was the status of women? Okay.
Yes, Selena, that's a very important question. Now, this was not a static situation, of course, and it varied for a period when you had a distinct shortage of women, because remember, only 40% of the women were, sometimes those ships had less than 40%, which was the mandatory thing from the 1870s. So women were in a stronger bargaining position. One, they were workers in their own rights, so they had a degree of freedom there, which was very important. They were paid as individuals, not as somebody's husband or somebody belonging to a family or something. So that gave them a degree of freedom. Two, they also had a degree of freedom to choose the man, because you didn't have the family pressure that you would have in India. These women went on their own. So if the man was useless and a rumsucker, as they used to call them, a drunkard, and a lot of these people were wife beaters too, they could say, look, I had enough of him, you see? And this was the context in which some of these so-called wife murders took place. There were quite a lot on the plantations. So on one hand, while women for a period had a greater degree of freedom on the plantations, the attraction to get married and settle in a village away from the plantation was always a very attractive proposition, because it was rooted in the idea of owning land. As I said earlier in the talk, most of these people, even the best agriculturalists, did not own the land they cultivated in these villages in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. So the ownership of land was like magic. And for a lot of women, being in a family situation where you own land and you could grow your own rice and rear a few head of cattle and grow your vegetables and so on, gave you a degree of freedom that you would not have had on the plantation. The other thing was, as these families got bigger, the woman in particular had a certain amount of influence in the way labor was delegated. Someone, a daughter-in-law might be sent off to work during the harvest season in the cane field as a weeder, or would be used, her labor would be very important during the rice planting and rice harvesting season. So what was happening there was that the woman was exchanging probably a greater degree of freedom to choose on the plantation for what I would consider a greater degree of financial and family security in the villages where they own their own land, and they could use the labor, the family labor, to cultivate their own land, but at the same time to use some of that labor, sending out some sons to work in the cane field during the harvest season and so on, which augmented the resources they had. The other thing about that was that the Brahmins, realizing that the Christian proselytizers were trying to win over these people, because this was seen as empty territory, so they wanted to win these people over to Christianity. And that was the context in which Brahmin priests started to administer to these people in the villages and to cook food, to go to their homes to do the puja and to take cooked food. For my great-grandmother, for a Brahmin to come and take cooked food from you, that was liberation in itself. So there was this interplay between the traditional and the conventional with its restrictions, and the translation of those traditions to this new environment which offered a degree of greater freedom. So it was a revolution in many ways, and because Hinduism was not dictated by some authority in Benares or wherever, the Brahmin priests had a great degree of freedom. So in many ways the Brahmin priests were revolutionaries to an extent, because they would never have gone to an untouchable house and do a puja. Even today, They would not go to an untouchable house and do puja and take cooked food from them. The other question about he made about caste. Now these castes were seen to be immutable. That you could not, even if you were educated as a Kshatriya, even a Kshatriya, one of the castes just after that, you could not just elevate yourself because of your earnings or your social position to Brahmin, because that's a ritual position that you had to be born into, and that is still the case, even in the Caribbean. And Ray, the legacy of these people in these smaller islands, well, let me say not all the Caribbean islands took indentured laborers. A place like Barbados really had no indentured laborers. A place like Antigua had no indentured laborers. You had small amounts that went to the Windward Islands, that is Grenada, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent. I mean small amounts, 3,000 to 4,000. And there, because it was such a small amount, it was extremely difficult for them to retain many of the practices of Hinduism, for instance. Because you need a Brahmin or somebody who is seen to be Brahmin or accepted as a Brahmin who could do these rituals. And in many cases, I would imagine you would have had very few Brahmins in that small sample of people going to Grenada or St. Lucia or St. Vincent. So the level of creolization was much greater there. And the shortage of women led to a considerable degree of intermarriages. There was also among the Indians in Jamaica, intermarried with African women. Quite a lot of that. Much less so in Trinidad and British Guyana, where you had a large amount of Indian women. So I think the degree of creolization, of adapting to a broader Creole kind of African cultural perspective, was greater in the smaller islands and the Windward Islands. In places like Barbados, none at all. And the Indians you see in Barbados are people who have gone there within the last 50 years. Many of them, business people from India, Gujaratis and Sindhis and so on. I want to thank you, and thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Okay, I think because we're going to be seeing the film on the life of Isfasad next, let's just take a quick 5-minute break if anybody needs to go to the loo. We've also got ginger there if anybody needs a drink. And also the bookstore there, just to make you aware, all of the books are £10 today. And they range between 15 and 25 normally. And of course Selena's artwork. So I'll give you all a shout in about 5 minutes, but it'll be 4:50 basically when we get back to it. So thank you.
Last year, Yesu Prasad was 90. You would probably know Yesu as a Guyana icon. A genius when it comes to entrepreneurship. But the best thing that Yesu did, to my mind, and we're going to Guyana soon to make a film on it, another film, is setting up something called IPEN, which is a microcredit system of lending money, small monies to the poor. And thousands of Guyanese, individuals as well as two, 3 people, groups of workers, have really benefited from IPEN, this microcredit system. It's one of the most remarkable untold stories about Guyana. And I'm really delighted. This film that we made to mark his 90th birthday, the editor of the film, the producer of the film, and the person who put a lot of imagination into the film, and actually the cameraman of the film is here. And he went to Guyana with his father, who's a veteran television producer, for nothing. And I think people gave us some dal and rice and good curry when we were there. But without much ado, look at the film. Thank you. You know, with drone shots, to make it artistic, textured, right? And I'm happy to say that it won a prize in here. What is it? The Documentaries Without Borders film festival. Alas, no money, but even a certificate. Did you get a certificate?
I got a certificate, yeah.
So we're now into filmmaking. We'll have to get Clem involved. We've joined up and we set up a company called Demerara Films. And so I've given up books now. The future is documentaries. Thanks. Are we going straight into the book launch? Yeah, all right, we go straight into the book launch. It won't take long because the food is waiting. You're hungry? Well, listen, we'll wrap up in 10 minutes, right? Bob Ramdani will chair the session. Bob is did his PhD at the University of Warwick, so it's apt that he should be chairing the session.
Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Come on. It's because we're going to eat shortly, so we want to be energized. You know, it's very, very difficult to follow, for example, Professor Seach around and to look at the wonderful film. And in my very short life, I've had the pleasure of meeting Yesu Prasad on several occasions, thanks to David. And although I have read a lot about Clem's work, it's the first time I actually met him. Unfortunately, due to her illness, and she actually fell over today, but due to family illness, Amina is not here with us, as you can tell. So neither of us are good substitutes, but at least we've had a good dose of what Amina thinks and what she chats about. And I really also wanted to say a personal thanks to her, because for my sins, and I will answer that question normally that I'm not shy about, but it's when anybody meets me, they says, Bob, are you Guyanese? Because Guyana then, of course, becomes the center of the universe. Oh, sorry. Guyana then is significant in many people's lives, including mine. So my mum, I'm not Guyanese, I'm Trini, but my dad is Trini, and my mum was Guyanese, so I equally say that I am Guyanese. And I do that particularly also because I started in 2014. I had never been to the interior of Guyana before in my life. And Keith Waite, whom I'm sure most of you know, is a good friend, said to me, I've just come back from the Rupununi Bob and you should take a trip. I had happily retired, and to be quite honest, Guyana was not on my list at all as somewhere I wanted to explore. Anyway, I listened and I went to the Rupununi and I fell in love with it. And since 2014, and I only just came back a few weeks ago, and will be there again in November, I have been on many, many, many occasions, and really Guyana is home to me now, I say it unequivocally, although I live in Barbados, so I'm totally confused. Totally confused. But it's my pleasure and privilege to represent the university here today on the book launch of Amina's book, The Bibliography of Indo-Guyanese Writing. My colleague, good friend, mentor, drinking partner, Professor Davidine, has introduced me to say a few words. One, because I have connections, having done my PhD at Warwick University, I'm still in connection with them. And two, sorry? Did you say I still owe fees? Oh, sorry. I was at university, thank God, when we had free education. It's something now I really do feel for people. And secondly, because I also worked with Arif at Hansard Publications, who publishes the work here. And when I said to Arif, when he says he's selling all the books at £10, and I said to David, do you think if we bought 3, what do you think? And David said 30 quid. And I said to Arif, there's no discount for pensioners or anybody like that. And he said to me, why do you think I'm holding the bag? I will only release it if you give me 30 quid. Thank you very much, Arif. But really, we're here to celebrate the work of Indo-Caribbean writers and Amina Ghafoor, who wrote as you all know, Aftermath of Empire, where she discussed the work of Roy Heath. When Roy died in 2008, Warwick University dedicated the Indo-Caribbean lecture that year to his name. Amina has been a stalwart in developing scholarship in the Caribbean and certainly in Guyana. Her work with the Arts Journal, we all know, is profound, and I think now in its 11th volume, the collection of work is very broad, intellectual, aspiring, and I recommend certainly that if you all haven't read her work, it is really worth reading the collections of works that are there. But it's my pleasure really to introduce my friend, my colleague, my mentor over many years, Professor Dabadine, to talk about the bibliography, and we'll take questions when he's finished. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob. So we're here to launch this bibliography of, it's not Indo-Guyanese writing, it's writing about Indo-Guyanese people. It's written by people of all backgrounds. It is, by the way, the most extensive and thorough bibliography.
Allow me to hold the book up.
Yeah. It is really.
I don't think it was too
and
yeah.
And I have to say, in my introduction to the book, she asked me to write an introduction. I referred many times to Clemcy Charan, because this book talks about early 20th century writers like 19th century writers like Rohoman and Beichu, who would have been completely lost to history were it not for the scholarship of Clemcy Charan. And this book, the introduction, acknowledges that fully. Now, she can't come because she fell down today. She said we were hoping to Skype her, but she's a quite remarkable woman in her own right. As a philanthropist, she funds a lot of medical. She gives a lot of medical assistance to people suffering from diabetes and its consequences. And she's also a scholar and a teacher. So she has sent me a little message today to say she sends all her love to you. And I will not say more about her book, except let me just quote a little, one sentence from Professor Kenneth Ranchand on books like this. He said, writers are not writing about Indians for the sake of emphasizing Indianness, but more to create understanding and deepen meaning of the many cultures which coexist. On that point I'll end, but before I end, let me just alert you to the fact that Pat Rodney, Walter Rodney's widow, is giving on the 29th of October at the University of Warwick the Walter Rodney Memorial Lecture, which has been going at the University of Warwick since 1984. Clemcy Charan gave the Walter Rodney Lecture, I think, in 2006. And I don't think there's anybody else here. Anyway.
Is there anything else? Hold on.
And she's coming, and she's also agreed to come and do a Guyana Speaks event, which Juanita Cox is organizing. So look out for that. Walter Rodney's widow, Pat Rodney, coming to talk at Warwick and in London. Go on, Arif. The food is getting cold.
Listen, they're not telling you about the importance of this book. This lady spent years, I imagine, putting it together. And you would find...
Start again.
No,
Start again.
No, I don't need that. Yeah. You will find the early pages of the book. Very interesting. It's only about 5 or 6 of you who picked up this book. It's over £15. And we are asking you to pay £10. But it isn't that. It's very good for you, especially those of us who've got children and grandchildren, to have the information very easily put together. Ramdani and Abedid up there really should read the book, so that they can tell you.
We've bought that. We've bought it.
How interesting. As a matter of reference, David edited the book. But he doesn't want to push himself on that. But it is a lovely, simple, easy to read book, and especially the early pages, maybe up to 50. Fantastic information. And as the publisher, I found it very... Okay, let me say I must push his book. Next thing I know, David will come up here. David, I've done with 10 books for David. He will tell me to push his book. And before that, Randani will tell me he wants me to publish his book. But here, let's get back on the serious side before we go and eat. Because I'm really hungry now. But if you can afford it, take a copy. Okay? It's because it's a good document. And Abina did really a good job. And it's good to see so many of you out there. Take care.
Okay, just to round off, just to let you know about future Guyana Speaks events. If you aren't already on our Facebook site and you use Facebook, please do use it because we post a lot of information about Guyanese events in London and also all over the world in the diaspora, not just our events. So you will see information about the Pat Rodney's event in Warwick. That's on Tuesday the 29th. We will hopefully, all being well, have Pat Rodney here on Sunday the 27th, so for October. And then the month after that in November, which is the 24th of November, we're doing an event on tourism in Guyana where we're going to talk about how to get around Guyana and where to go. For those of you who are interested in ever revisiting, but also just for the beauty of the shops, it's worth coming. And then, as always, on the 8th of December, we'll be holding the Border Bazaar. I don't know, some of you have been here before for that, some of you haven't. The Border Bazaar is basically, we recreate Border Market in here, so we get sugar cane, have sugar cane juice, coconut shies, all kinds of Guyanese product, Guyanese food, all sorts of things. So basically it's a market recreated in here and it's really a lot of fun. And if anybody has any stalls or any products they want to sell, then please do let me know. You're all welcome to join in. We normally use the Border Bazaar as an opportunity to raise money for different sorts of things in Guyana. We did one previously for the children in the Pomeroon, and the money we raised from that we managed to get a boat, an engine for a boat that took the kids to school that they didn't previously have. And then last year, what do we do? POTS, yeah, so prevention of teenage suicide. So we raised money for that. So we haven't actually put our thinking hats on this year as to what we'll be doing, but we will be doing something. So yeah, that's pretty much it, I think, from my side. But please, if you haven't already put your emails down, please also put your emails down on the in the book that's by the door, just so that you're kept informed of events like this, particularly in terms of events that are going on at Warwick University as well that you might be interested in. And I just want to say thank you very much to Chandra because she turned up with a huge cake because it was my birthday very recently. So I'd like you all to join in and have a slice of the cake as well, along with the food that Jafar has provided at the back. This is my husband here.
I've been doing over the summer a Guyana Speaks walk. A few of you have been on it. We go from approximately around Old Street to back. It takes about 2 hours, and what I've done through the work of UCL, we've identified the properties and the individuals that benefited from the monies from the enslaved Africans reparation. No, sorry. From the Slave Commission, excuse me, compensation monies, which is a lot of money, and it involves a lot of Guyana money. And what I do is identify 12 different properties on this walk and individuals, such as Gladstone, such as the Baring family, such as the Border family. But those that have come, I think, have learned something new. So we're going to try and do it again next week, Saturday, if I have enough interest. I need at least 5 people to make it worth my while. So the sheet is at the front there if you'd like to sign up for it. We do charge £10 per person, but you'll come away with it bursting with knowledge. And I actually give you the slides. There are about 60 slides that go along with that for the research that I've done. So that's it.
Put your hands together for everyone. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Davide. Thank you so much, Ronnie. And where's Professor Clem? Is he hiding somewhere? Thank you, Arif. yeah, yeah, Clem's at the back there. But thank you so much. So please do enjoy the complimentary food. Well, it's not complimentary, you pay for it at the back. Roasted chicken, pumpkin, and chana, and cake.
And a round of applause for Juanita.
Ah! Thank you.